Silence. A silence so sharp it seemed to cut through the walls of the boardroom. Steve Jobs sat still, his fingers tapping against the polished table. In the reflection of the glass, his face looked older, more fragile than the myth of the untouchable genius would ever allow. His eyes burned with a mixture of rage and regret, but beneath them a faint trace of fear lingered. This was not the image the world remembered, the messiah of technology, the black turtleneck prophet who bent industries to his will. This was something else. A man trapped in the shadows of his own decision, a decision that once promised him the world and demanded everything in return. The boardroom echoed with ghosts of his past, the betrayal that cut him out of Apple, the return that crowned him king again, the endless nights crafting beauty from machines, and the single monumental decision that sealed his destiny, to gamble everything, not only the company, not only his career, but his very body and time on an idea the world didn't yet understand. But let us step back into the days before that silence, before the applause, before the myth. The hunger of a young man in the beginning, Jobs was nothing but hunger wrapped in skin and bone. Hunger for control, hunger for beauty, hunger to bend the future into the shape of his imagination. In his parents' garage, he was already more than a boy. He was a prophet in exile, restless, burning, half-mad. Steve didn't build computers just to sell them. He built them as if he were carving a window into a different universe. He wanted perfection, not just circuits and screens, but harmony. He wanted machines that were not machines, but extensions of human dreams. And so, Apple was born. And so, Apple grew. But ambition has a price. He was a tyrant to his team, merciless in pursuit of his vision. He demanded the impossible, then demanded it faster, cleaner, more elegant. He was not satisfied with good enough. To Steve, good enough was betrayal. Yet that same ferocity created cracks in the kingdom. The boardroom, those men in suits, those silent accountants began to whisper. They loved the numbers, but feared the man. He was unpredictable, volcanic, and above all, uncontrollable. And in 1985, the unthinkable happened. Steve Jobs, the founder, the visionary, the very soul of Apple, was forced out of his own company. The exile, it was supposed to break him. And for a while, it did. Imagine it, the prodigy, humiliated, stripped of his crown, wandering the tech desert. He poured himself into Next, into Pixar, into anything that would let him prove them wrong. But late at night, when the offices were empty and the silence returned, he knew the truth. He wanted Apple back, not for the money, not even for revenge, but because it was his. It was the only thing he had ever truly loved. Years passed, the world moved on. Computers multiplied, competitors rose, and Apple without him withered. Products without vision, decisions without soul. By the mid-1990s, Apple was no longer a dream. It was a corpse waiting to be buried. And then the wheel turned. In a twist as dramatic as any Greek tragedy, Apple called him back. The man they exiled was now their only hope. Steve returned, not as a wounded king, but as a dark avenger. He walked through Apple's halls like a ghost reclaiming his castle. But this return demanded a decision. The fork in the road. When Steve looked at Apple's scattered product lines, he saw chaos. Too many computers, too many compromises. His executives wanted gradual fixes, slow corrections, safe bets. But Steve knew safe bets were poison. One night, alone in his office, he drew a simple chart, a 2x2 square. Consumer, professional, desktop, portable, 4 products. That was it. Everything else would die. It was a brutal choice. Thousands of jobs, millions in investments, entire divisions erased with the stroke of a pen. His advisors warned him. Apple could collapse under such violence. But Jobs didn't flinch. "Focus," he whispered to himself. "Focus or die." He was not afraid of death, of the company's or his own. He was afraid of mediocrity. And so the decision was made. Slash everything. Burn it to the ground. Build one machine that would define the future. That machine became the iMac. And with it, Apple's resurrection began. The temptation of power the iMac sold, more than anyone expected. Its colors, its curves, its simplicity, suddenly, Apple was not a relic anymore. It was cool. It was alive. But with victory came something darker. Steve felt the old hunger return, sharper than before. If he could resurrect Apple once, why not reshape the entire world? He pushed further. The iPod, the iTunes store, music in your pocket, then the iPhone. A revolution disguised as a phone. And finally, the iPad. Each decision was a gamble, each gamble bigger than the last. Billions were staked on dreams that could have turned to ash. But each time, the world bent to his will. Each time, the myth grew. And yet, deep down, Steve knew the truth. His time was running out. The body that once carried him through sleepless nights and endless battles was failing. Cancer had entered the story. And here, again, stood the darkest decision of all. The shadow of mortality. Doctors offered him surgery. They offered him treatment. They offered him hope wrapped in statistics. But Steve was not a man who trusted doctors. He trusted himself. So he chose recklessly, stubbornly to fight his cancer his way. Diets, juices, spiritual remedies. He delayed the surgery. He believed he could bend his own body as he bent the world. It was a decision born of pride. A decision that cost him years. By the time he surrendered to medicine, it was already too late. But even then, he refused to show weakness. On stage, he appeared thinner, paler, but his eyes still burned. He unveiled the iPhone as if it were scripture, the iPad as if it were destiny. Each presentation was a sermon, each product a prophecy. Behind the applause, though, there was silence. The silence of a man running out of time. The price of vision in the end. Steve Jobs' greatest decision was also his most destructive. The decision to live by his own rules, no matter the cost. He saved Apple. He changed the world. He created beauty out of metal and glass. But he also sacrificed his body, his relationships, his peace. For every triumph, there was a shadow. For every billion earned, a sleepless night. For every standing ovation, an empty silence waiting at home. The world called him a genius, but genius is never free. And so we return to that boardroom silence, where Steve Jobs sat alone, staring into the reflection of a man both immortal and fragile. A man who made a decision and lived with its consequences. Because every decision, especially the ones that shape empires, demands a sacrifice. The silence of the boardroom lingers, like an echo refusing to die. But Steve Jobs was never one to remain silent for long. His voice, sharp as glass and heavy with conviction, broke through. He knew that what he built would outlive him, but he also knew it would consume him. This is the paradox of power. The higher you climb, the more fragile the air becomes. Steve understood this better than anyone. A kingdom built on fire. The return of Jobs had not simply saved Apple. It had transformed it into something the world had never seen. He reshaped the company into an empire of desire. No longer were computers gray boxes of numbers and function. They were art. They were identity. To own an Apple product was not to own technology. It was to belong to a vision. But empires are not built with mercy. Behind every glossy iMac shell, behind every iPod commercial drenched in color and rhythm, there were the scars of decisions too brutal to be spoken aloud. Entire teams dismantled, competitors outmaneuvered and left to rot. Partnerships severed in silence. Steve demanded excellence, and anything short of that was discarded like defective parts. He carried the company on his back, but that back grew heavier with each passing year. And yet he thrived on that weight. He seemed addicted to it. His genius was fire, and Apple was his fuel. The more he burned, the more the world lit up with his creations. But fire, no matter how brilliant, eventually consumes everything. The iPhone gamble, the iPod had conquered music. The iTunes store had redefined how the world consumed art. But Jobs wasn't satisfied. Music was not enough. He looked at the phone, an object everyone carried, yet no one loved. To Steve, it was an opportunity wrapped in glass and metal. He envisioned a device that was not a phone at all, but a universe in the palm of your hand. The board hesitated. The risk was enormous. Telecommunications was a battlefield of giants, Nokia, Motorola, BlackBerry. To enter that space was to declare war on empires already fortified. But Jobs made his decision. He gathered his team in secret, swore them to silence, and demanded the impossible. He demanded a device with no keyboard, no clutter, just a sheet of glass that could become anything. He demanded perfection where perfection had never existed. The engineers whispered it could not be done. Jobs stared through them, his eyes dark and unwavering. Do it anyway. Years later, in 2007, he walked onto the stage in his black turtleneck and unveiled the iPhone. The crowd gasped. The industry trembled. It was not a product launch. It was a funeral for every competitor who would soon be buried. That day, Steve Jobs didn't just introduce a phone. He rewrote human behavior. He altered how billions would live, communicate, and dream. And yet, as the applause thundered, his body was already betraying him. A body in revolt. Jobs's mind was immortal. His vision limitless. But his body was fragile. The cancer he had once defied with diets and denial returned, sharper and more merciless than before. He hid it as best he could. On stage, he was fire. Off stage, he was ash. His cheeks hollowed, his gait slowed, his skin clung to bone. But he refused pity. He refused to step back. His empire was still rising, and he would not abandon it. Each keynote became an act of theater, a duel with death. He stood before the world, thinner each year, unveiling miracles, while his body decayed beneath the spotlight. The crowd saw brilliance. His family saw fragility. Steve saw both. And he chose brilliance. The iPad and the last push. The world believed the iPhone was the climax, the summit of his genius. But Steve was not finished. He dreamed of a device that would sit between the phone and the computer. Something light, seamless, infinite. The iPad. Once again, doubt filled the air. Critics called it unnecessary, mocked it as a giant iPod. But Jobs ignored them. He always ignored them. When he revealed the iPad in 2010, the same critics fell silent. The device became not just a product, but a symbol of Apple's dominance. Another industry bent the knee. But with each victory, his body weakened. The empire rose as its architect crumbled. It was the cruelest symmetry. The brighter the flame, the faster the burn. The decision he could not escape. Steve Jobs had made countless decisions in his life. To drop out of college. To start Apple. To fire. To create. To return. To gamble. But there was one decision he could not control, the decision of time. In 2011, after years of fighting, he resigned as CEO. The stage, the spotlight, the silence, it all slipped away. He had built the most valuable company on earth, yet he could not buy another year, another month, another day. In his final days, he reflected. Not in public, not with cameras, but in the solitude of his family. He spoke of regrets, not the products, not the empire, but the moments he had missed. The quiet dinners, the unspoken words, the hours lost in the shadow of ambition. The man who gave the world connection had often failed to connect with those closest to him. The man who gave humanity tools for communication sometimes could not find the words to reach his own children. This was the hidden cost of his decision. The silence returns. On October 5, 2011, Steve Jobs died. The world mourned. Millions lit candles, wrote tributes, whispered thanks to a man they had never met, but who had shaped their lives. Apple continued. The empire he built marched forward, its foundations unshakable. His name became legend, his story a modern gospel of genius and obsession. But behind the legend, there is still the silence. The silence of that boardroom. The silence of a man staring into his reflection, asking himself if it was worth it. The lesson in Shadow's Steve Jobs' story is not simply one of triumph or failure. It is the story of decisions that carved history, decisions that demanded blood, decisions that no one else had the courage to make. He chose to burn brighter than anyone, knowing the flame would consume him. He chose to create beauty at the cost of peace. He chose to gamble his body against time and lost. But perhaps that is the nature of visionaries. Perhaps genius is not about balance, but about sacrifice. Perhaps the only way to bend the world is to break yourself in the process. And so, when you hold an iPhone, when you sit before a glowing Apple screen, you are not holding just technology. You are holding the weight of decisions, the shadow of sacrifices, the echo of a man who dared to gamble everything. Steve Jobs lived and died by the choices he made. And in the end, that was his greatest invention. A life defined not by chance, but by decision. The silence remains, because every decision leaves an echo, and Steve Jobs' echo will never fade.